Welcome to this special edition of To Life LChaim. Joining me today is Professor Alan Dershowitz, who is very graciously, and I thank you in advance, very graciously agreed to share with us his reflections on the recent Israeli elections, and I hope we can touch on other topics as well.
By all means.
But let's open with the elections. Want to get your take, first of all. The elections seemed to go within the course of 12 or 14 hours from a horse race just too close to call to the next morning a mandate.
Well, I think a lot of Israeli voters remain undecided until the last minute, and Prime Minister Netanyahu made a strong pitch. People could agree or disagree with the nature of the pitch, but he made a strong pitch to try to get people from the right, people to the right of him, not to vote for their favorite small party, but to bring their vote to Likud. And he succeeded. So the polls missed that changing phenomenon that occurred at the last minute. That explains the early polls. The exit polls are more difficult to explain. It may be that some people voted for Netanyahu, but told the exit pollsters that they hadn't. That's happened before. And it's unclear why the exit polls were so wrong.
So you attribute this stunning outcome to basically the Prime Minister being able to cannibalize off the smaller factions. And how would you typify that? Scaring them into voting for him?
Well, first of all, I don't think it was such an unpredictable outcome. The number on the right and the number on the left altogether didn't change that dramatically from past elections. It's just that Likud managed to gather people from other parties. Well, I think what his pitch was he needed a united Likud. He needed a strong showing in the Knesset to be able to have a mandate to do what he had to do. Whether, if there were scare tactics, it's because Israelis are scared. I mean, scare tactics don't work on people who have great hope. We have to remember that Israelis voted overwhelmingly for the left and for labor, and then when the left in 2001 made a tremendously generous offer to the Palestinians for peace, Yasser Arafat not only rejected it, but ordered an intifada in which 4,000 people were killed. That really weakened the peace movement, the left in Israel. So the Palestinian Authority, particularly Arafat, even though he's long gone, bears considerable responsibility for Israel's shift away from its traditional adherence to the left and its movement toward a party or parties on the right that emphasize the fear element rather than the hope element.
The left now, I would perceive, if they are not getting this great turnout on peace issues, which for better or for worse seem to be somehow a second level consideration for many. What about the economic and social, the housing issues?
First of all, I think peace issues are still foremost in the minds of Israelis. I think it's been very frustrating. Israel offered the Palestinians a two-state solution in 2001. Ehud Olmert offered it to them again near the end of his tenure in office, and there were even some rumblings that maybe Netanyahu a couple of years ago was willing to consider the American plan. And the Palestinians have not only refused to accept peace offers, they have often refused to even come and negotiate and sit at the table. So it takes amazing chutzpah for Saeb Erekat and others on the Palestinian side to say, oh, this proves that Netanyahu isn't interested in making peace. It's the Palestinians who have not been interested in making a compromise peace from the very beginning. They won't even utter the following words: we recognize Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. I was with both the former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority and the President of the Palestinian Authority, and I said to them, just say those words. They wouldn't do it. Instead, they're satisfied to bring Israel to the International Criminal Court, which will backfire on the Palestinians, and to the United Nations, which might give them a paper victory, but it won't bring them any closer to statehood. On the economic issues, it's not clear which side will help solve those issues. There are those on the right who say that the housing shortage is going to be helped by more settlements on the West Bank. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that we're going to see, we're going to see Netanyahu continue essentially his freeze on settlements beyond the security barrier while allowing Israel to grow up within the areas that will remain part of Israel. But I'm not an expert on Israel's domestic economic issues. I know a lot more about the security issues.
But I just want to go back. Where do you think the economy is going to go, or where do you think Israelis would like it to go?
Well, on where it will go, the Talmud says, of course, that prophecy ended with the destruction of the temple. Anybody who tries to prophesy any economy is either a fool or a knave. If I could prophesy the market, I'd be a billionaire. I can't do that, neither can Israel. Israel has a very sound economy, and largely it is to the credit of people like Netanyahu who helped create a free market economy and freed Israel from the constraints of labor control that dominated for so many years. I think the Israeli economy is strong. Now, if Europe ever were to adopt a BDS movement against Israel, it would hurt, because Israel's most important trading partner is not the United States, it is Europe. And if Europe were to put the screws on Israel's exports, it could really hurt the economy.
Now, I want to go back to something you said as well, that you feel if the Palestinian Authority does press in international court and war crimes, that's going to backfire on them. What did you mean by that?
Well, Israel hasn't committed war crimes, number one. It has fought a war more lawfully than any country in the history of warfare, and any fair determination will establish that. Also, Israel has the best judicial system in the world for dealing with problems that grow out of military operations, far better than the United States. The United States has issues of standing that you can't really challenge the government in many instances about how it conducts warfare. In Israel, anybody, a Palestinian, even a non-citizen, can bring a case in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is extremely responsive to these cases. So if the International Criminal Court in any way follows its own rules, Israel will be completely exculpated and vindicated, whereas Hamas will be charged with double war crimes. Every time they fire a rocket from behind a civilian, they commit 2 war crimes. And certainly the Palestinian Authority has incited terrorism through what it permits on its state-controlled radio and television and its state-controlled imams who preach on Friday the kind of hatred that leads to terrorist acts.
For our viewers, I'd like you to just clarify, because this is the first time I'm learning that Israel has such an open policy and a remarkable policy on standing before the court.
Right. Well, Israel has
far exceeds America.
Much better than America. Also, Israel's legal system within the military, the Judge Advocate Corps, under Israeli law, any decision made by the Judge Advocate General is binding on the military. That's not true in the United States. In the United States, it's advisory. The United States follows generally what civilian authorities tell it the law is or what its military authorities do. But in Israel, it's binding. All in all, Israel has the most responsive system in the world for how to deal with problems that develop during military activities for understandable reasons. They have been involved in warfare since well before their establishment, and they've always had an extraordinarily moral army, the holiness of arms. They have philosophers on their staff debating the pros and cons of targeted killings. You need to get approval for every targeted killing. Once the International Criminal Court gets into the weeds and looks at how detailed Israel's approach is to controlling excesses of the military, every country has excesses of the military. The question is not whether a military acts in an excessive way, it's how the country responds, how the legal system responds, and Israel's response is better than any in the world.
For our viewers, could you just clarify, they may not get the full impact of what we're discussing, what the issue of standing is? Standing
means, in the United States, if you and I want to bring a lawsuit because we don't like the war in Afghanistan, the courts will throw us out. We have no standing. We have no particular interest. We have no dog in the hunt, is the way it would be put colloquially. Israel, you don't have to have a dog in the hunt. All you have to do is be a citizen and have a complaint, and you can bring it, and the Israel Supreme Court will listen to it. Many other barriers to judicial review that exist in the United States don't exist in Israel. This was largely the contribution of former President Aharon Barak, who was educated at Harvard and Yale, and is regarded as probably the leading jurist in the world on issues of human rights during wartime. And he helped to develop the Israeli judicial concepts. He was followed by then Dorit Beinish, the president of the Supreme Court, and now since by two other presidents, all of whom carry out this policy of being open, having the courts open to any complaints about how military operations are being conducted. The Israeli courts have stopped military operations in the middle. There was a case where it was alleged that Israeli soldiers were using Palestinians, it was called the neighbor policy, holding Palestinian civilians in front of them when they went to knock on a door to see if there were terrorists inside. And the Israeli Supreme Court said, no, you have to stop that. And they made them stop it as it was going on. And there are many other instances of where Israel has had to stop things that were militarily advisable, but according to the court were in violation of the rules of law. No country in the history of warfare has ever had a higher standard of compliance with the rule of law, has had lower civilian casualties, better ratio of terrorists to civilians killed, and more concern for complying with international laws regarding humanitarian efforts.
That's fascinating. We could spend hours just talking about that concept.
But the interesting thing is, Israel is the best in the world, and yet it's condemned more than all the other countries in the world combined. That tells you something about the condemners rather than the condemnees.
Let's try to wind our way back to the elections, although that was an important aside. It's really impactful. The election results, I read this piece saying that Herzog is now the Prime Minister of Tel Aviv. Seems to be a great disparity, great polarization between the right and the left. We are familiar with that in America, and painfully familiar. Do you see that happening? Is the election an indication of that?
The analogy to America is totally flawed. The Israeli right, unlike the American right, generally is not interested in imposing restrictive social constraints on Israel. For example, issues of abortion, issues of gay rights, issues of the death penalty, issues of gun control. The issues that divide the American left from the American right are off the political radar in Israel. The issue of right and left in Israel is largely twofold. Number one, how to deal with the threats, external threats, security issues. Even there's not all that much of a division on the issue of, for example, Iran. Israel is united. David Grossman, a person who speaks with authority from the left, said that Netanyahu was right about his concerns about the Iran deal. So issues of security divide the right from the left, but not all issues. And of course the economy, and traditionally you have a more socialist inclined economy on the left, a more free market economy on the right. So the right-left divide in Israel is very different from the right-left divide in the United States. To make comparisons.
For the American mentality, right and left is just wrong labels to use.
For some, now, the religious right in Israel, the extreme religious right, is somewhat akin to the religious right in the United States. But it's relatively small. Obviously, it's below 20%. The numbers are hard to gauge exactly.
Just I know, again, you're not an economic forecaster, but do you think the results of the election, although being hailed as a mandate for the Prime Minister, are also a wake-up call?
I would hope so.
To remind him on domestic issues?
I think every election should be a wake-up call. My own hope is that he now has a mandate. Perhaps he will move toward sitting down and negotiating some reasonable result with the Palestinians. This might not be the perfect time for Israel to withdraw its military presence from the West Bank, considering ISIS being so close to Jordan in many ways. But it's always the right time to see if some rapprochement could be made with Palestinians. It's also the right time for Netanyahu to speak on behalf of a united Israel against the current Iranian negotiations and what looks like the deal that may emerge from them. Virtually all Israelis are united against that deal. Herzog made a very serious blunder, which may have really cost him several seats toward the end of the election. I like Herzog. I know him. He's a terrific man and will be a great leader of the minority. But he made a serious mistake when he said he trusted President Obama to produce a good deal. Israelis don't trust President Obama to produce a good deal. I don't trust President Obama to produce a good deal. Most American congressmen don't trust Obama to produce a good deal. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, the Emirates don't trust Obama to produce a good deal with Iran. And so when Herzog said he trusts Obama to produce a good deal, I think he put a number of Israeli potential voters off.
So Obama's the kiss of death still.
Well, on Iran, not necessarily on other issues, but on Iran, Obama is about to make a tragic historical mistake with regard to Iran. He will become known, if this deal goes through, and if Iran in 10 years or 8 years or 6 years develops nuclear weapons, he will go down in history as the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century. A president who did a good deal of good domestically, but who failed to recognize the greatest evil of the 21st century, namely a nuclear-armed Iran, in the same way that Chamberlain, who was a very good Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister, failed to recognize the greatest evil of the 20th century, Nazism, and failed to recognize that you can't stop that evil by giving into it, in the same way that Obama has failed to recognize that you can't stop the evil of Iran's mullahs by giving into it.
Speaking of America and foreign policy, in retrospect, what do you think about the speech the Prime Minister gave in Congress?
Well, I was there. I was sitting literally 3 seats away from Sarah Netanyahu and 2 seats away from Elie Wiesel. So I saw the reaction of Congress. Substantively, it was a superb speech. It had a big impact on many Congress people. I saw friends of mine in the Democratic Party, not Nancy Pelosi, but I saw friends of mine in the Democratic Party who were really cheering with enthusiasm and really listening carefully. I really do think that he made the substantive case very well, particularly on several issues. On the issue of the sunset provision, why not require, before the sun is allowed to set and before Iran is allowed to develop nuclear weapons, why not require it to give up exportation of terrorism, its threats against Israel, and its intrusion into the politics of neighboring states, and the issue of the centrifuges. I think on those issues, he was very, very persuasive. Look, it would have been better if the president signed on and invited him as well, and the president would have invited him if he said what the president wanted him to say. The issue of protocol, total, complete nonsense. If everything were the same, but Netanyahu had come to praise the deal rather than to damn it, the president would have been thrilled. What the president was upset about is what Netanyahu was saying on the merits, because it changed minds, not how he came about to be invited.
White House reaction to the election?
Very undemocratic. You don't condemn the results of an ally's election. You don't intrude into the politics of an allied state. Look, a lot of us didn't like some of the rhetoric that emerged in the final days of the election, but the idea of the president and the White House intruding and expressing its views on that, it seemed to me was somewhat misguided.
I would think perhaps it even backfired on them.
Well, I think there's no question that Netanyahu took advantage of the antagonism between Obama and Israel, and it probably helped him pick up some votes. Look, the Obama administration has proved that it is incapable of negotiating difficult agreements. Its negotiating tactics with regard to Iran have been amateurish. And it's
even Cuba.
Well,
and that should be relatively easy.
But the issue of trying to have an impact on the election of an ally, neither country should. The United States should not try to impact Israeli elections. Israel should not try to impact American elections. Of course, this is not the first time. Obviously, Winston Churchill tried desperately to impact the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940 because he knew that Roosevelt's election might lead to America joining the war, whereas the election of the Republican opponent would almost certainly lead to American isolationism. So countries do have an interest in impacting other countries' elections when their national security is at stake, but certainly not when they just prefer one leader to another.
To go back, you raised the issue of the rhetoric towards the end of the election cycle. The Prime Minister finally came out definitively saying no Palestinian state. That's a very big step.
I hope not.
It opens him to a lot of criticism. Do you think it was just rhetoric, that he'll walk it back?
I hope so. I hope so. Look, I strongly support the two-state solution. I have I've been on record since 1970 of supporting a two-state solution. I hope there still is opportunity to do that. So far, the barriers to the two-state solution have not come from Israel, no matter who the prime minister is. It's always come from the Palestinian side. So maybe it was just tough rhetoric. Tzachi Hanegbi, who often speaks for the prime minister on security issues, indicated the very next day that they're prepared to sit down and negotiate with the Palestinians. The Palestinians have always set preconditions for negotiation. So let's hope that the rhetoric of the election is over and that there can be movement toward a peaceful resolution.
How do you think, after being so definitive, how can he walk it back, though, in the court of Israeli public opinion?
Well, he was definitive when he said he favored a two-state solution as well. And the question is whether or not there are ways of preserving Israel's security, and that comes first, and also giving the Palestinians their democratic rights to which they're entitled. I think there are ways of doing that. I hope that we will see movement in that direction. I also hope we will see in the future, and the Prime Minister did talk about that later, encouraging Arab Israelis to vote. It's a very good thing. And encouraging them to play a greater role in Israel's politics. Now, you know, none of us like some of the positions that the Arab parties take. There are some that refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist, period. There are some that seem to support Assad in Syria and perhaps even Iran. But that's the nature of a democracy. And the more people vote in a democracy, the better everybody is.
We were talking a little bit about the administration. I know you are a very keen observer of American behavior. How is this going to play out? Are things going to get worse between the White House and the Prime Minister? Apparently
they are. The White House is apparently being very petulant and trying to take revenge against Prime Minister Netanyahu for his victory and the way he achieved it. And in the process, it's taking revenge against the Israeli people. People forget that polls show that the vast majority of Israelis favor the two-state solution, between 63 and even higher numbers, much higher numbers than for the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, who are just above 50% in their support for the two-state solution. So Israelis want a two-state solution, and Israeli democracy is responsive to what the Israelis want. It would be foolish and counterproductive for the American administration to try to punish Israel for the way it voted in its election. There have been threats now that the United States will vote for or allow the Security Council to vote for a resolution demanding that Israel go back to its pre-67 lines. That would mean that every Jew who prayed at the Western Wall would be committing a war crime, that the Western Wall would be occupied territory, that Hebrew University would have to be abandoned because the access road to Hebrew University is a part of pre-67 Jordan, that Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, which was illegally captured from Israel in 1948, would have to be abandoned. And we go back to the situation where Jewish synagogues were destroyed and used as latrines, as happened under Jordan. The notion that Israel go back to 1967 lines is in complete violation of Security Council Resolution 242, which I played a very small part in helping to draft as an assistant and a friend of Arthur Goldberg, who was our representative to the UN, which contemplated, obviously, territorial changes. But if the United States were to vote for a resolution by the Security Council requiring Israel to go back to the 67 lines, it would be a total disaster, and of course it would be ignored by Israel. I don't think there's 5% of the Israeli population that would support that resolution.
One of the questions I, as an American, a Jew, obviously, but why is the White House, particularly President Obama, what is his end game? What is his motivation that's causing this animus?
I think we're seeing petulance, immaturity, amateurism, anger. I don't think we're seeing a policy at play. We're seeing personal antagonism playing itself out, much more on the American side than on the Israeli side. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been trying to reach out to the United States, trying to make sure that the relationship improves, but we're seeing real petulance from the White House. And there's no excuse for that. There's just no excuse for it. American presidents represent all the people of this country, and the people of this country support Israel overwhelmingly. And the president has no mandate for pulling back America's support for Israel.
Do you believe that, the break you and I were talking, just as an aside, that to call the Israeli election a mandate is a bit of an overstatement.
It is. Yeah.
It's not a clear mandate.
There are very few mandates. You know, President Obama says he has a mandate. He won the last election, but of course the Republicans won the last congressional election. So who has the mandate? The mandate in America is for divided authority, for a president who's a Democrat and for Congress that's Republican. And the president ought to obey that mandate when it comes to making the most important foreign policy decision of the 21st century, namely a deal with Iran. A deal with Iran should include congressional input and congressional approval. No deal that Congress disapproves of should become part of American foreign policy.
From the Prime Minister's side, let me ask you this. I don't think the Prime Minister is naive or starry-eyed enough to believe that this is an overwhelming mandate for him to take off on any tangent he wants. But does it allow him to be a bit bolder on the statement, the very clear statement he made before Congress, that Israel can and will, if need be, act unilaterally against Iran?
Well, that option always has to be kept on the table. Look, Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he says that, is only parroting what the President of the United States has said, namely keeping the military option on the table if necessary. The issue of a unilateral Israeli attack on Iran is very problematic, obviously. He would need the support of the military. Dagan, the former head of the Mossad, said he would have resigned in protest had the Prime Minister called for an attack on Iran. And so no matter what mandate a Prime Minister has, on an issue like Iran, a Prime Minister can't act alone. He must act with the support of the military, with the support of his inner cabinet, and with the support of the Israeli people.
So if you were sitting there around the table on the inner cabinet, what would you whisper in his ear today?
Well, I'm not a member, I'm not an Israeli. If I wanted to become an Israeli, I'd make Aliyah. So those decisions have to be made by duly elected Israeli officials. As an American, I encourage him to keep pressure on the American Congress to satisfy its own constitutional obligations to advise and consent and to be a co-equal branch of the government when it comes to foreign policy. The President has the authority to negotiate a deal, but a deal can't become part of American policy unless and until the United States Congress approves it.
As an American, the issue of terrorism, Israel has led the way in fighting terrorism. I don't think we are able to say the same thing about America in many ways.
Well, America has been second. I mean, Europe has been the worst. The hypocrisy of Europe allowing terrorism, getting in bed with terrorists for so many years as long as Europe wasn't attacked. Now, of course, Europe's being attacked, and so suddenly European anti-terrorism is becoming more in the forefront. But America has played a very positive role in fighting terrorism generally over the years after Israel.
We're going to soon be in an election cycle. What would be your hopes for public policy shift for 2016? What do you think the candidates will be saying or will need to say?
I hope both candidates, the Democratic, the Republican candidate, will both show strong bipartisan support for Israel and not follow the policy of the Obama administration, certainly during his last 2 years in office. And so far, I do not see any of the candidates overtly supporting the president on this issue. So I think we'll see greater support for Israel as we get closer to the presidential election.
And on terrorism?
Well, I think all Americans have been tough on terrorism. Look, I think it's so interesting that Netanyahu has been the single most outspoken voice against terrorism, but now he's very correctly making it clear that ISIS is not nearly as much of a threat as Iran. Terrorism, that's people with machine guns and trucks. They pose a danger, but nothing close to the danger posed by a nuclear Iran. So I think Netanyahu sees ISIS where it's supposed to be in context. And we, the United States, should not be compromising our position in relation to Iran's nuclear weapon because they may be helping us with ISIS. Iran needs our help in relation to ISIS more than we need theirs. ISIS poses a direct threat. Sunni ISIS poses a direct threat to the Shia domination that Iran would like to see in the Middle East. It poses no direct threat to the United States. So we're helping Iran. Iran's not helping us much. And we should not allow the fight against ISIS to let Iran dominate all of Iraq, which is what they would very much like to do and what they're in the process of doing.
So for us, it's keeping our eye on the prize.
And the prize is a nuclear Iran, number one. Number two is our terrorism. And number three probably is the destabilization in the Middle East as evidenced by what's going on in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, all places where Iran has its dirty hands in trying to destabilize in order to get a foothold.
And South America as well.
Well, South America is changing very, very quickly. I think a lot of South Americans are fed up with hard left, and that's beginning to show. South America is very much in play still. We haven't seen a resolution there.
Before we conclude our interview, I'd like to shift a little bit. People know you, of course, as a commentator and the wonderful advances you've made as a lawyer and the issues you've taken on that have been an inspiration to so many people and a wonderful example to so many people. But I know you attribute a lot of that to your Jewish upbringing.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And I'm actually writing a book about that now. It's called Abraham, the world's first, but certainly not last Jewish lawyer. And Abraham made me a lawyer. I'll never forget reading the story about Abraham arguing with God over the sinners of Sodom. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. The judge of all the earth will not himself do justice. Chalila, chalila lacha. And it gave me inspiration to argue with my rabbis. If Abraham could argue with God, why can't I argue with my rabbis? And I did. It didn't do me very well in the yeshiva as an elementary school student, but learning how to argue through the Pilpul, through the Talmud, through various ways of argumentation, really stood me in very good stead as a law student, as a lawyer. And so I love my Jewish upbringing, my Jewish background. I like being able to use my Jewish background to challenge secular thought, to use my secular background to challenge Jewish thought. I live in a world of conflict, and conflict is good for intellectual development.
Let me put it this way. American society nowadays, lawyers get sort of a bum rap. A lot of lawyer jokes.
Good. There's some really funny ones even, right?
But tell me about being a lawyer as a sacred undertaking.
Well, we are the last barrier to tyranny in any society. That's why Shakespeare had his evil character say, first let's kill the lawyers, because that's what Stalin did, that's what Hitler did, that's what Mao did, that's what Castro did. All of the dictators first killed the lawyers, because the lawyers pose the greatest danger to tyranny. You might not like who we represent in any particular case, but probably wouldn't have liked Abraham representing the sinners of Sodom either. Or God, or Moses arguing with God about saving the lives of those who had built the golden calf and worshipped it. But lawyers have to defend everybody who's in trouble, and that's what I've tried to do all of my life. I do most of my cases pro bono without legal fee. Many of my clients have been Jews in trouble all over the world. from Sharansky to a poor Jew somewhere in the south of France who is being put into prison with many people who will pose a danger to him. I spend a good deal of my time providing free representation through Aleph and other organizations to Jews in trouble all over the world, and I get a tremendous amount out of doing that.
So there is a sacred dimension to law for you.
There is, and if you think that the country is bad with lawyers, imagine a country without lawyers. Imagine a country where you had nobody to go to if your rights were being violated. I get probably 10 calls a day from people whose rights are violated, and I try my best to provide whatever assistance I can. I don't always agree with what they did or what they was accused of doing, but neither does a doctor have to agree with everything that his patient does or stands for. When a person is wheeled into the emergency ward, the doctor's job is to cure them, and my job is to defend my clients, whether I agree with what they've done or not.
If Abraham was the first lawyer, it sort of juxtaposed in my mind that he was the first monotheist.
Mm-hmm. Also the first iconoclast, he smashed idols. The first Zionist, he made the first aliyah to the promised land. He was the first of many, many things.
And the interesting contribution, I don't know if you want to speak about this, perhaps the first great voice in history that said law is absolute. Mm-hmm. Law is not subject to
There I disagree
man.
with you. There I disagree with you.
How so?
He said law is not absolute. He said if you were to kill 10 innocent people in the city of Saddam, that would be too much, but he stopped at 10. And if God had to kill maybe 2 or 3 innocent people in order to destroy all the evil of Saddam, Abraham didn't say it's absolute. He didn't follow what Maimonides ultimately said. He who saves a single life is as if he saved the world. He who takes a single life is as if he's destroyed the world. I think Jewish law has been relative.
I was thinking of absolute in a little different sense, that law is something rooted in our perception of the divine.
Well, you know, you can love law and accept law whether you accept the divine or not. Sacred has many meanings. Some of the greatest lawyers in history have not seen a divine inspiration.
But I'm talking about you.
Well, I struggle with the issue. I struggle with the issue. The God with who I often argue is the Jewish God. I don't understand the argument that says God works in mysterious ways. I hate the God of Job. I rail against the God of Job. How dare the God of Job kill Job's innocent children in order to win a bet with the devil? Of course, Nachmanides, the Ramban, says that didn't happen, that God just hid his children in a cave in order to see how he'd react. I actually wrote a book based on that premise called Just Revenge, where I have a character who does much the same thing as an act of revenge against the Holocaust. So I think any intellectual has to always struggle. You can't accept absolutes. You always have to think of the possibility you're wrong and somebody else might be right. But in the meantime, you have to continue to do what you do and what you think is best for humankind.
So the book on Abraham, when can people anticipate seeing it on the shelf?
Just before Rosh Hashanah. It'll be out this year.
Apropos.
Apropos, and it's a good Rosh Hashanah gift, hopefully. And it talks about, its title is Abraham, the world's first, but certainly not last Jewish lawyer. But it talks about the impact of the Bible generally on law, on morality, on our legal system, on the role of lawyers. I mean, I juxtapose Abraham's arguing with God over the sins of Saddam with his refusal to argue with God over the order to bring his own son, the one he loves, up to the mountain. I talk about Abraham, the redeemer of captives, Pidyon Shivuim, with rescuing Lot, buying real estate for his wife's last resting place, deceiving kings by saying that his wife is his sister. I go through all of this, shattering idols, and I use each of those stories to exemplify different kinds of lawyers and approaches to law throughout history.
I can't wait.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is available right now for our viewers, though, is Terror Tunnels.
Oh, yeah.
Very timely. I can't imagine how you put it out so quickly to get it out there.
Well, I was inspired. I was taken to those tunnels before the war began. I was taken by one of the leading generals. I went through the tunnels, and my friend Danny Grossman, who was a former Top Gun in the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force, escorted me there. And we saw the tunnels. The tunnel we went in was just yards away from a kibbutz kindergarten with 52 children. That was the target. And fortunately, the Israelis discovered it and sealed it. But it was clear to me once I went into that tunnel that war was inevitable, that Israel would have to destroy the tunnels on the Gaza side because they didn't know where they ended. They only knew where they began. And so I quickly wrote a book called Terror Tunnels about the war in Gaza and justifying what Israel had to do to destroy these tunnels of death that just simply were built to have death squads come up and kill as many Israelis as possible. I think thousands of Israeli lives were saved by the destruction of those tunnels.
And I believe I saw this week, seems to be new construction on the tunnels.
There's always going to be new construction. There's going to be construction in the north. There are going to be tunnels that will tunnel from Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon into northern Israel. There may be tunnels from the West Bank. There certainly are going to be continuing tunnels from Gaza until Israel comes up with a perfect technological solution to the tunnels. An iron dome underground rather than just one above ground. Tunnels will pose a considerable threat to Israel's security.
And for our viewers, you know, I'm always wondering if Americans truly perceive the mentality of besiegement 24/7.
Yeah, and since 1929, we're talking about a war that will soon reach 100 years, and Israel has tried so hard over the years to resolve it. And it accepted the two-state solution in 1938, 1948, 1967, 1993, 2000, 2001, 2007. And the Palestinians have always said, no, we want there to be no Jewish state more than we want there to be a Palestinian state. And until and unless that mentality changes, regardless of what prime ministers say or what politicians say, the key is going to be the Palestinians' willingness to recognize the nation state of the Jewish people is here to stay. There will always be a presence of a nation state of the Jewish people in Israel. Once that's accepted, a movement toward peace is inevitable. But without that, there'll never be peace.
Do you believe that for each American, there's this old conflict? How can you be a good American and be a Zionist? And if you love Israel, go to Israel. If you love Israel so much, pick up and go there. Many of us love Israel, but no, we don't pick up and go there.
Well, many Catholics love the Vatican. They don't pick up and go there. Many Irish Americans love Ireland. We are a country of multiple loyalties. Many feminists put their gender before their loyalty to country. Many gays have the same thing. Many African Americans have the same pull and tug. And many Jews do as well. But we are loyal Americans. We've proved our patriotism over and over again. We've contributed disproportionately to the success of this country. And we believe that support for Israel is good for America. That's been proved to be true over the years. I see absolutely no conflict. As a patriotic American, it's my duty to oppose my government when my government is doing something that I don't believe is in the interest of world peace, interest of the United States, interest of our greatest ally, Israel. So I'm going to continue to fight for America, to fight for Israel, and to make sure that the support for Israel remains bipartisan and universal all through the United States. And I don't see any conflict.
Professor Dershowitz, our time is up. I thank you. The viewers of Jewish Life TV, thank you.
Thank you.
You've been watching this special edition of To Life LChaim. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week on To Life LChaim. That's it for this edition. Please visit our website, tolifelchaim.com, for more information about our show and to watch previous episodes. I'm Rabbi Yaakov Thompson. Thank you for watching, and To Life LChaim.